Hi, Pastor Brett Murray, First United Methodist Church here with our morning devotion. Today I want to talk about John chapter 12, specifically the place where it talks about the Pharisees or the Jewish leaders who had become disciples of Jesus, who had come to understand who he was and follow him, and their silence before the other Pharisees, the other leadership. Essentially what this passage is reminding us is that there were people back then who were trying to follow Jesus, but because of the position that they were in and because of the tension that it held with their colleagues or with their peers within their community, they were afraid to be open and upfront about it because of the consequences that might follow. Now, I think that's a very, very real fear that they experienced then. And I'm thankful that we today don't live in that kind of fear and tension, that simply by proclaiming our devotion to Christ, that we're in danger of jail or death. And so I'm not trying to presuppose any, judgment of hellfire and brimstone on these believers back then. But I think sometimes we kind of gloss over that piece of the story. And I think we do it because when we look at the whole of the story, we see that, all of these things worked out because it was part of that story that leads Jesus to his redeeming work on the cross and the resurrection. And so when we see Jesus' life tracking that way, we look at a lot of these incidents and these circumstances that go into it, and we see it as something that was necessary to transpire in order for that work to go to completion and fruition. And that's not a bad interpretation or understanding of how that worked into the story. But we can't shy away from the fact that some of those things that happen in the midst of the story also give us an example of how we should not necessarily behave as people of faith and as followers of Jesus Christ. If you want to, just two simple examples, Judas betraying him, I do not think we should take that as ends justify the means. And so if us betraying somebody else leads to a conclusion that we think is beneficial, we should go ahead and do it. We look at Peter denying Jesus 3 times. That's part of the story, but I don't think that's something that we should emulate. Peter striking off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Jesus corrects him in there. And so while all of that was part of the story and maybe necessary in pushing it to fruition, it's not necessarily something that we can take as a handbook on what is and is not okay. And I would say that's the same with the situation with these leaders who kept silent about their faith and their discipleship with Jesus. Their silence and passivity was certainly part of what allowed the other leaders to move forward and with the arrest and the false accusations and ultimately the crucifixion of Christ. And I think this is an important thing for us to bear in mind with everything that's happening right now in our country. There's a lot of reasons, I'm sure, that people are shying away from conversation about what happened in Charlottesville. For some people, it may be they're afraid of offending a family member or a friend. For some of our political figures, it may be some kind of attempt at expediency and hoping they're not going to tick off a portion of their constituency or their base. For other people, it may just be, if you're watching any of the talking heads in the media circus surrounding everything right now, it seems like the media is trying to foment just constant discord between the people that they pit against each other. And many times at the outset, the people that they're talking to start out with statements of agreement. They start out with condemnation of these hate groups, but then they diverge because one wants to stay on the condemnation of the hate groups and the other wants to also start talking about the violence that happened in Charlottesville and about how some of that violence was mutual, and that's where the disconnect comes. And as soon as that disconnect happens, then they start to go at each other. And one is saying, you're calling me a bigot and I'm not. The other is saying you're not a bigot, but the fact that you also want to talk about these other things that happen indicates to me that you don't want to stay focused just on the big issue of standing against these hate groups. And so I can understand why in heated exchange that happens, but also seeing that happen is something that causes the rest of us when we're watching to maybe want to shy away from that and become like those followers of Christ who didn't want to say anything because they were afraid of what the Pharisees were going to do, what they were going to talk about. Well, I want to encourage you that this is something we do need to dialogue about. Particularly in Pennsylvania, there's 40 different hate groups across the state. Many of them are considered to have membership statewide. And there's even one that exists, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, right down the road from here in Marion and state line. So if we think that this is not something that is starting to resurge, then we're missing the point. And it's why we need to be unafraid to talk about it, to be gracious with each other, and to be honest, and to have very real discussions. And I think the way we do that is by finding first the common ground. And what I hear over and over again as common ground is the condemnation of what happened in Charlottesville in these white power, white supremacist, neo-Nazi groups that are steeped in a history of violence and hostility. And I think that's something that separates that side of things from the other. Because not only is the rhetoric hateful, but it's coming from a place of proven aggression through history, whereas the other side is coming with a rhetoric of love and peace, and they come from a tradition of peaceful protest and demonstration, which puts them at odds right off the bat. And so if we can come to that understanding and come to that mutual understanding that we all are standing against these hate groups, that becomes the platform for further discussion. And maybe at first we need to leave it there and just let that settle so that we can get familiar with one another in our common stance against these groups. And then the next piece to it is, because somebody inevitably is going to bring up the fact that there were mutual combatants there, which is another valid point. However, I think we need to see that point within its context. First, the violence that comes from that side of those demonstrating on behalf of love and peace is something that goes as an aberration to what the majority were doing and is not in concert with their rhetoric. And so when we see that, we also then recognize that we stand with this group that was confronting. And what we need to do is then call for us to police ourselves and to say, no, we are not going to participate in that violence. And if that's something that you want to do, you need to not be part of this experience because it stands against everything that we stand for. So I think we can address this openly and honestly and faithfully. And I think the conversation has to be had. But don't let yourself get pulled in to these convoluted conversations, and don't let yourself get pulled in to the arguments and the headbutting just because we see them on television, and let that cause you to back off in fear. If we come together, if we find that common ground of what we stand opposed to, if we find our common ground of faith in a Savior that tells us we are equal before God, we are all loved equally by God, and we are all called to live into a life of peace and grace before God, if we can do that, then we establish that commonality of purpose and focus on Christ. And then we can take the next step, which is to say, now how do we live that out together? How do we invite one another to stand for this in a way that honors God and honors Christ? And how do we help those whose anger or whose frustration seems to be getting the better of them? How do we get them to tone down and to come along for the ride the way that it should be done? And watch what that does in the world around us. So I want to encourage you. Be strong, be kind, be gracious, be loving, and be unafraid to have those important, sometimes hard conversations that lets the world know where we stand and keeps us focused on what's right, no matter what's happening around us, and no matter how the world might be tempting us to go off track by pitting us against one another. Have a great day.